Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin friends and Formula One fans here after the practice night in Las Vegas. It didn't take long before all the hype surrounding this race was gone. We saw 8 minutes of the first free practice and then the session was already over. It was a bit strange. First we saw the yellow flag and had no idea what was going on. Then we saw Carlos Sainz slowing down, park his Ferrari at the side of the track, and then the red flags came out. We wondered what was going on. The TV pictures didn't really shed any light on the situation. You could see Sainz drove over something, then the engine went out, he rolled out, and that was it. Later, of course, pictures from the track cameras came out, but you couldn't see them in the live broadcast. I'd be interested to know why that wasn't clarified, whether they didn't have better pictures or whether they deliberately didn't want to show us that, because the matter was precarious and quite embarrassing for Formula One. We were able to reconstruct it all wonderfully afterwards. Esteban Ocon drove over a water valve cover and his car was pretty badly damaged. More on that in a moment. Fernando Alonso followed behind. He saw debris on the track and was able to avoid it. Carlos Sainz right behind him didn't see it. There was already a yellow flag. He also took his foot off the gas but then had no chance to avoid it. And as we saw on the CCTV images, he really flew into the air when he drove over it, landed roughly, and quite a lot was damaged. But what was broken on the track? We've often seen it in Formula One history that gully covers break somehow. They are usually torn out, pulled out by the suction generated by the floors of the Formula One cars. In this case, it was completely different. The bolted connection was checked several times and everything was okay at all points. But the concrete frame was actually broken on the outside. However, this was not a result of the strong downforce of the Formula One cars. This suction effect is not so strong that it would cause the concrete to break. No, the cars sat up heavily in that particular spot and thus caused this extreme load that caused the concrete to break. The consequence was that F1 could no longer drive at all. They had to look at all the holes or all the water valve covers, as the technical jargon goes. There are 30 of them on the strip alone, which is where you reach the highest speeds. And then a solution had to be found. They actually found one with quick drying concrete. This is a mixture of concrete and epoxy resin. All 30 holes on the strip were then at least once set in concrete. That took a while. Firstly, the process itself, until it was done, and then of course the drying process. The second free practice session could therefore only be started after a long delay, only at 2:30 a.m., 2.5 hours later than originally planned. The session was then extended to 90 minutes because there was virtually no driving in the first session. The session ended at 4 o'clock in the morning. The entire paddock was really annoyed. As I told you yesterday, we were already pretty annoyed by the whole schedule and now this long delay. But you have to say we still have it good. The fans, they were the ones who really suffered because they waited for ages to see the cars on the track and then they weren't allowed into the stands at all. So on the one hand, communication was pretty poor. We knew early on that the session would have to be delayed, that it would certainly not take place at midnight. For FP2, however, they simply said that the session would be delayed. For the fans, of course, this was relatively unpleasant. They waited, and then when they had waited long enough for the session to start, they were actually not allowed into the grandstands. The stewards had to call it a day at some point. And yes, of course, it was a real debacle here at the start. The question is, who is to blame? Are the track designers Hermann Tilke and Carsten Tilke responsible? Ultimately, it's Formula One that exerted too much pressure to do the whole thing in far too short a time. Is it the FIA that is inspecting the track? It's difficult to say. In general, you have to admit that this has happened on many circuits. It can always happen, and you hear that it simply couldn't have been checked. What do you want to do with the concrete? Do you want to hit it with a hammer until it really breaks? It's just a stupid situation. I think you just have to make do with it. But not everyone sees it that way. Directly after the first free practice session, there was the team boss's press conference. Toto Wolff was one of the people sitting there. And of course there were lots of questions about this disaster in the first free practice session. Then came the question, has Formula One already started this Las Vegas weekend with a black eye? Toto Wolff didn't like the question and played it down a little. He said, no, nobody will be talking about it after the second free practice session anyway. Nobody watches the first free practice session anyway, especially not in the time zone that Europe is currently in. And that didn't go down too well with a colleague from the Daily Mail. He hadn't even asked the question, but he was sitting in the front row of the press conference and then simply shouted at Toto, "That's garbage." He didn't want to accept that. Toto Wolff then got a bit personal. He attacked the journalist, saying that he had never written anything good about the sport or about anyone. Toto said he should show respect for what had been created here. Everything is wonderful, a great event, a new level, and so on. New standards that are being created here. Toto really talked himself into a rage. It almost reminded me a bit of I Have It Printed Out. In fact, the Netflix cameras were also present at this press conference. Maybe that had a bit to do with it. I hope you get to see this in all its glory. You didn't see the interjection in the press conference broadcast. Those were spectacular scenes that took place after FP1 at least. Formula One has become a huge PR machine. A very, very interesting topic, and you can read about precisely this topic in our next print edition. I have good news on the one hand and bad news on the other. The current print edition is actually sold out, but you can already pre-order the next print issue. And there's a very, very interesting story, I think, about Formula One, about the PR machinery. Whether we are really experiencing a hype or whether we are just being fooled. I analyzed the whole thing together with former F1 driver Alexander Woods, and there is also a very, very exciting interview. In the current issue, we talk to FIA President Mohammed bin Sulayem, and in the next issue, we will be talking to the reigning world champion Max Verstappen, who has revealed that he is not a particularly big fan of the race in Las Vegas. You can always find the link in the video description. Fred Vasseur was also sitting next to Toto Wolff in the press conference, and he was anything but in a good mood. I've already said that Carlos Sainz was the one who suffered the accident, and he should start by telling us how great he thinks Las Vegas is. But Fred Vasseur couldn't find anything good because he was really angry. Chassis, engine and battery broken, chassis even really punctured. That's really tough. You have to count yourself lucky that nobody was injured. Fred Vasseur said the whole thing was unacceptable. And when he was asked again how nice it all was here in Las Vegas, he almost lost it, and then Toto Wolff, of all people, calmed him down a bit. But Fred Vasseur said to him, "If you were in my position, you'd be upset too." Fred Vasseur will have been even more upset because the energy store was broken and they had to install a new one, i.e. a new battery. It was the third one, and that comes with a penalty. Now, of course, an application has been made. It's not their fault at all, but the stewards said they understood all that, but the rules leave them no room for maneuver. They have to penalize Carlos Sainz for it, plus 10 places on the grid. Common sense is difficult to reconcile with the regulations. That's just the way the rules are, and it's particularly bitter because Ferrari is really strong here. We already mentioned it yesterday. In theory, this track suits the SF23. And then second free practice, Charles Leclerc with the superior best time. Carlos Sainz, they actually managed to repair the car. Esteban Ocon also had a lot of damage to his car after FP1. He was also able to take part in the second session. Sainz in second position, already half a second behind. That shows how good this Leclerc time was. He is also a specialist on these street circuits. So the penalty for Carlos Sainz is doubly bitter. But we may be in for an exciting sporting weekend. Fernando Alonso was able to confirm Aston Martin's upward trend again. Third position for him, then the first Red Bull with Sergio Perez, 0.8 of a second behind for him. Max Verstappen only in sixth position, 0.9 of a second behind. Sure, it was only practice. Sure, the strength of the RB19 is the race trim, but the gap is, of course, a decent mark. And somehow there's a bit of hope that Ferrari can spice things up again. Now it's up to you. What do you think of the whole story? Was it a symptom of the exaggerated show here in Las Vegas that they didn't take care of the track? Can that happen? I've already said that I wouldn't put too much stock in it. Sure, it wasn't advertising, especially the communication policy. And what happened with the fans is absolutely unacceptable. Imagine if you really only bought a one-day ticket. Many VIPs are only there for one day, and then a story like this. Really bitter. I'm sorry, but at least we now hopefully have a really exciting race weekend ahead of us. I have to admit that I liked the pictures of the track much better than I had expected. It also looked reasonably challenging. It's not the most beautiful track for the drivers, but I think it was better than expected. And now we're looking forward to what we hope will be an exciting, sporting weekend. And let's just forget about the show for now, and we've already forgotten the story about the manhole cover or the water valve cover.